briefing room at CIA headquarters in Langley fell silent as William Harvey slammed the classified folder onto the mahogany table. The date was April 22, 1956, and the folder contained photographs of Soviet cables pulled from the Berlin Tunnel, the most ambitious intelligence operation in CIA history. What Harvey didn't know, what none of the 12 men in that room could have possibly known, was that every word in those documents had been carefully prepared by the KGB. The tunnel they believed to be their greatest triumph was actually a stage, and they were performing exactly the script Moscow had written for them. Across the table, his British counterpart from MI6 sat quietly, his face revealing nothing, but his mind racing with calculations about how much longer the deception could hold. The Berlin Tunnel operation had begun not in Germany, but in London, 2 years earlier, when American and British intelligence officers first conceived an audacious plan. They would dig a tunnel from West Berlin into the Soviet sector, tap into underground communication cables used by Soviet military and intelligence services, and intercept thousands of conversations that could reveal Moscow's intentions during the Cold War's most dangerous years. The technical challenges were staggering, requiring engineers to construct a 1,426-foot tunnel beneath one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world without detection. The intelligence value was potentially unlimited, offering access to unencrypted communications between Soviet commanders, KGB officers, and military installations across Eastern Europe. But the operation's success depended entirely on absolute secrecy, and that secrecy had been compromised before the first shovel broke ground. George Blake sat in the London planning meetings in 1953, his notebook open, his expression attentive, contributing ideas about how to minimize detection risks and maximize cable access. His colleagues from MI6 saw a dedicated officer, a man who had survived 3 years as a prisoner during the Korean War, and returned to service with renewed commitment to fighting Soviet expansion. What they didn't see was the transformation that had occurred in that North Korean prison camp, where Soviet interrogators had turned him not through torture, but through patient ideological persuasion. Blake had become a true believer in communism, convinced that the West represented imperialism and oppression, while the Soviet Union offered humanity's best hope. When he returned to London and was assigned to the joint CIA-MI6 planning group for the Berlin Tunnel, he knew exactly what he had to do. The first meeting with his Soviet handler took place on a rain-soaked evening in November 1953, in a safe house in North London that smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. Blake arrived carrying documents that detailed the tunnel's planned location, its technical specifications, and the specific cables it would target. His handler, a KGB major named Sergei Kondrashev, read through the materials with growing astonishment. This wasn't just valuable intelligence. This was complete foreknowledge of an operation that would cost the Americans and British millions of dollars and represent their most sophisticated technical penetration of Soviet communications. Kondrashev asked the question that would define the entire operation's future. Should Moscow simply reroute the cables, making the tunnel worthless, or was there another option? The answer came from KGB headquarters in Moscow after 3 weeks of deliberation at the highest levels of Soviet intelligence. They would let the tunnel proceed exactly as planned. The Americans and British would spend their millions, dig their tunnel, install their sophisticated recording equipment, and intercept thousands of Soviet communications. But the communications would be carefully curated, a mixture of genuine low-level traffic that seemed authentic and deliberately planted, material designed to mislead Western intelligence about Soviet capabilities, intentions, and strategic thinking. The operation would require extraordinary discipline, briefing hundreds of Soviet personnel about which cables were compromised without revealing how Moscow knew, maintaining the deception for months or potentially years, and ensuring that nothing in the intercepted traffic revealed Blake's existence. But if successful, it would transform the West's greatest intelligence coup into Moscow's greatest deception. Blake delivered updated information to his handlers throughout 1954 as tunnel planning progressed from concept to engineering reality. He provided details about the construction timeline, the specific equipment being installed for recording and transmitting intercepted signals back to CIA facilities, and the American personnel who would staff the operation. Each piece of information allowed Moscow to refine its deception plan, identifying which communication channels would be monitored and therefore which ones required careful management. The KGB established a special unit, designated Department D for Desinformatia, tasked exclusively with generating the false traffic that would flow through the tapped cables. Officers were assigned to compose messages that sounded authentic, discussing maintenance issues, personnel transfers, logistical problems, and low-level intelligence matters that would seem valuable without revealing anything genuinely sensitive. Construction of the tunnel began in September 1954, using a cover story that the Americans were building a new radar installation near the sector border. The actual work took place underground, with engineers working around the clock in shifts, excavating dirt that had to be removed secretly to avoid suspicious piles that Soviet surveillance might notice. The tunnel required sophisticated engineering, steel reinforcements to prevent collapse, ventilation systems to provide breathable air a quarter-mile underground, and soundproofing to ensure digging noise didn't carry through the earth to Soviet listening posts. The CIA brought in their best technical officers, men who had designed listening devices for embassy penetrations and submarine cable taps. William Harvey, the operations commander, personally supervised every phase, his paranoia about security leaks driving him to limit access and compartmentalize information so completely that even most CIA officers in Berlin didn't know what was being built. Harvey was a legendary figure in CIA operations, a former FBI agent who had moved to intelligence work and made his reputation running aggressive operations against Soviet targets. He was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely convinced that the KGB had penetrated Western intelligence services at multiple levels. His security protocols for the tunnel operation were extreme even by Cold War standards. He rotated construction crews to prevent any single worker from understanding the complete scope, used false paperwork to disguise the tunnel's true purpose, and restricted knowledge of the cable tapping mission to fewer than 50 people across both American and British intelligence services. Yet despite all his precautions, despite his justified paranoia and sophisticated security measures, Blake's information continued flowing to Moscow because Harvey never imagined the leak could be British, coming from officers he considered partners rather than potential threats. The tunnel reached the Soviet cables on February 25, 1955. The engineering team carefully exposed the cables without cutting service, installed induction taps that could intercept signals without physical connection that might be detected through routine maintenance, and activated recording equipment that would capture every communication passing through those lines. The first intercepts came through within hours, Russian voices discussing mundane military matters, supply requisitions, maintenance schedules, and personnel complaints. The CIA translators and analysts who processed this material were ecstatic. The conversations sounded completely natural, exactly the kind of routine traffic they expected from a military communication system whose users had no idea they were being monitored. They had no way of knowing that in Moscow, KGB officers were reading transcripts of the same conversations, and smiling at how perfectly their deception was working. Blake continued his regular work at MI6 headquarters, participating in briefings about the tunnel's intelligence production, offering analysis of the Soviet materials being intercepted, and maintaining his cover as a dedicated British intelligence officer. The psychological strain of his double life was considerable, though he rarely allowed it to show. He would sit in meetings where CIA and MI6 officers celebrated breakthroughs from tunnel intercepts, discussing Soviet military deployments and command structures that Blake knew were partially fabricated. He would contribute to analyses that he knew were based on deliberately misleading information, watching his colleagues draw conclusions that Moscow wanted them to draw. The cognitive dissonance required enormous discipline, maintaining enthusiasm for intelligence that he knew to be tainted, while appearing frustrated by the same limitations and gaps that genuinely puzzled his colleagues. The tunnel's intelligence production exceeded even the optimistic projections that had justified its enormous cost. Within 6 months of operation, the CIA had recorded more than 440,000 Soviet conversations, transcribed and translated thousands of hours of communications, and assembled detailed profiles of Soviet military organization, signal protocols, and command relationships in East Germany. Analysis sections at Langley worked around the clock processing the material, identifying patterns, cross-referencing intercepts with other intelligence sources, and producing reports that shaped American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. The material seemed to confirm existing estimates about Soviet force levels, while revealing fascinating details about morale problems, equipment failures, and bureaucratic dysfunction within the Red Army. It was exactly the kind of mixture, broad confirmation of known facts plus revealing details, that makes intelligence analysts confident they're seeing unfiltered reality. In Moscow, the KGB's Department D refined its deception program based on feedback about what the Americans found most credible. When CIA analysis showed particular interest in Soviet logistics, Department D increased the volume of supply-related communications, carefully crafting conversations about fuel shortages and maintenance backlogs that suggested Soviet military readiness was lower than actual capabilities. When analysts focused on command relationships, Department D produced conversations that exaggerated tensions between political officers and military commanders, reinforcing Western assumptions about friction between Communist Party oversight and professional military judgment. The deception was sophisticated enough to include occasional genuinely sensitive information, calculated leaks that would seem too valuable to be intentionally planted, reinforcing American confidence that they were accessing authentic, unguarded communications. Blake's handlers in London met with him monthly, careful encounters in safe houses, parks, and once memorably, in the British Museum, where Blake passed film containing updated tunnel information while appearing to study Egyptian antiquities. The KGB was careful never to demand so much information so frequently that Blake's unusual access patterns might attract counterintelligence attention. They understood that protecting their source was more important than maximizing immediate intelligence gain. Blake's value wasn't just the tunnel. It was his position within MI6 that gave him access to broader Western intelligence planning. Exposing him to gain some tactical advantage would sacrifice a strategic asset who could potentially provide information for years. So the meetings were spaced carefully, the dead drops used sparingly, and Blake's instructions emphasized caution above all else. The operation continued through 1955 and into 1956, becoming so routine that the initial excitement gave way to bureaucratic normalcy. Analysts processed intercepts according to established procedures. Reports flowed through standard channels, and the tunnel became just another intelligence source, extraordinarily productive, but no longer generating the amazed attention it had initially commanded. This normalization was exactly what Moscow wanted, embedding their deception so deeply into American intelligence assessments that distinguishing truth from fiction became impossible. The tunnel's intercepts influenced national intelligence estimates about Soviet intentions, shaped military planning about how NATO forces should be positioned in Europe, and contributed to diplomatic strategies based on assumptions about Soviet weakness that Moscow was carefully cultivating. If you're still here watching this moment when espionage became theater, when the greatest technical achievement in intelligence history turned into an elaborate performance staged by the very enemy it was meant to expose, go ahead and like this video and comment the word deception below. Let's see how many of us understand that, in the spy game, the most dangerous victories are the ones your enemy allows you to win. William Harvey began noticing inconsistencies in early 1956, subtle patterns that troubled his paranoid instincts even if he couldn't articulate exactly what seemed wrong. Some of the intercepted Soviet communications seemed almost too perfect, confirming American assumptions with convenient precision. A conversation about equipment shortages would mention specific systems that CIA analysts had been wondering about. A discussion of personnel transfers would name officers whose positions had been unclear in existing intelligence files. The information was valuable, undeniably useful, but Harvey had spent too many years in counterintelligence not to be suspicious of intelligence that arrived too neatly packaged. He began requesting technical checks of the tunnel's equipment, wondering whether the Soviets might have discovered the tap and were feeding false traffic through the compromised cables. The technical inspections found nothing wrong with the equipment, and Harvey's concerns were dismissed by analysts who pointed to the sheer volume and apparent authenticity of the intercepts. How could the Soviets possibly fake hundreds of thousands of conversations involving thousands of different personnel across multiple communication networks without someone making a mistake that would reveal the deception? The operational security required would be impossible to maintain. Harvey couldn't argue with that logic, and he had no evidence beyond instinct that anything was wrong. But his unease persisted, manifesting in increased security protocols, more frequent equipment checks, and growing tension with colleagues who thought his paranoia was undermining the operation's analytical productivity. Blake learned of Harvey's suspicions through his normal access to MI6 briefings about the tunnel operation, and he immediately informed his KGB handlers. Moscow's response was swift and decisive. It was time to end the operation, not because Harvey's suspicions posed an immediate threat, but because the deception had achieved its strategic objectives. The Americans had been fed false information for over a year. Their intelligence assessments were thoroughly contaminated with Soviet disinformation, and continuing the operation risked eventual discovery that might expose Blake. The KGB began planning how to shut down the tunnel in a way that would seem natural, avoiding any indication that they had known about it all along and protecting their source by making the discovery appear accidental. The end came on April 23rd, 1956, when Soviet soldiers and KGB officers staged a dramatic raid on the tunnel, bursting through the endpoint near the tapped cables with weapons drawn and photographers ready to document the discovery. The scene was carefully orchestrated, presenting the tunnel's exposure as a triumph of Soviet vigilance rather than the termination of a controlled deception. Soviet press released photographs showing the tunnel's sophisticated equipment, denouncing it as proof of Western espionage and Cold War aggression. Western newspapers ran stories about the operation's exposure, with some praising the CIA's audacity, while others questioned the wisdom of such provocative intelligence operations. The coverage served Moscow's purposes perfectly, allowing them to score propaganda points while concealing the fact that they had controlled the operation from its inception. Harvey and his team watched the Soviet discovery with professional disappointment, but also pride that the operation had run successfully for 13 months before exposure. They reviewed the intercepted material, confident that despite its premature termination, the tunnel had provided intelligence worth many times its cost. CIA leadership shared that assessment, and the operation became legend within the intelligence community, cited as an example of technical ingenuity and operational daring. Classified studies analyzed what had made the tunnel successful and what lessons could be applied to future operations. None of those studies imagined that the entire operation had been a Soviet deception, or that a British officer sitting in secure facilities in London had betrayed it before construction began. Blake continued his work at MI6, his role in the tunnel's compromise unknown and unsuspected. He had been too careful, his tradecraft too sophisticated for the casual security reviews that followed the tunnel's exposure to identify him. The KGB had protected him perfectly, ensuring that nothing in how the Soviets discovered and shut down the operation pointed toward a high-level source within British intelligence. Blake's career continued to advance, his wartime imprisonment giving him credibility, and his apparent dedication earning him assignments with access to increasingly sensitive operations. From Moscow's perspective, the tunnel operation had been a complete success, not just for the disinformation they had fed through it, but for the way its compromise had further established Blake's security, proving that even when operations he knew about were exposed, the exposure left no trail back to him. The truth began to unravel 3 years later, through a chain of events that had nothing to do with the Berlin Tunnel. A Polish intelligence officer named Michael Goleniewski defected to the West in 1960, bringing with him fragmentary information about Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence services. He couldn't name names, but he described a British officer who had been recruited during or after captivity in Korea, who had access to joint Anglo-American operations, and who had provided information about technical intelligence operations in Berlin. The description was vague, potentially fitting several dozen officers, but it was enough to trigger a counterintelligence investigation that would eventually focus on George Blake. The interrogation of George Blake began in April 1961 in a safe house outside London, where MI6 counterintelligence officers confronted him with Goleniewski's information and their own accumulated suspicions. Blake maintained his innocence for less than 3 hours before confessing, not because the evidence against him was overwhelming, but because his ideological commitment made him willing to accept the consequences of his beliefs. He described his recruitment, his motivation, and the scope of his betrayal in detail that shocked even experienced counterintelligence officers. When they asked specifically about the Berlin Tunnel, Blake confirmed what they had begun to suspect, but hoped wasn't true. He had told the KGB about the tunnel before construction started, and the Soviets had known about it throughout its entire operation. The revelation struck the CIA and MI6 like a physical blow, transforming what they had considered their greatest success into their most complete failure. Analysts began the painful work of reviewing every piece of intelligence the tunnel had produced, trying to determine what had been genuine and what had been Soviet deception. The task was nearly impossible because the KGB's disinformation had been so sophisticated, mixing truth with lies in proportions that made separation incredibly difficult. Some intercepts were certainly authentic, genuine low-level communications that the Soviets allowed through because they contained nothing sensitive. Others were clearly fabricated, but identifying which ones required comparing tunnel intelligence against other sources. And many of those other sources had themselves been influenced by assessments based on tunnel material. The contamination was comprehensive and potentially irreversible. William Harvey, retired by the time Blake's confession became known, received the news with bitter vindication. His instincts had been correct, the intelligence had been too convenient, too perfectly aligned with American assumptions. But knowing he had been right brought no satisfaction, only rage at the betrayal and frustration that his warnings hadn't been heeded more seriously. He spent his final years convinced that Western intelligence services were thoroughly penetrated by Soviet agents, that every success concealed a deception, and that the Cold War was being lost through compromise and naivety. His paranoia, which had once made him an effective counterintelligence officer, curdled into cynicism that alienated former colleagues and left him isolated. Blake's trial was held in secret, standard procedure for espionage cases, where public proceedings might reveal sensitive sources and methods. The evidence against him was overwhelming, based not just on Goleniewski's information, but on Blake's own confession, and corroborating details that eliminated any possibility of mistake. The prosecution outlined a betrayal that extended far beyond the tunnel, including the identification of British agents operating in Soviet territory, most of whom had subsequently been arrested and executed. The human cost of Blake's treason was measured in dozens of deaths, agents who had trusted Britain to protect their identities and who died because Blake sold those identities to the KGB. The judge sentenced him to 42 years in prison, an unprecedented term that reflected the extraordinary scope of his betrayal. Blake served only 5 years before escaping from Wormwood Scrubs prison in October 1966, in an operation that likely received KGB assistance, though the details remain disputed. He made his way across Europe to Moscow, where he was welcomed as a hero, given Soviet citizenship, and awarded the Order of Lenin for his services to the Soviet state. He lived in Moscow for the rest of his life, working as a translator and consultant, occasionally giving interviews in which he defended his actions as ideologically motivated rather than mercenary. He expressed no regret for the agents whose deaths he caused, arguing that they were casualties of a just struggle against Western imperialism. He died in Moscow in December 2020 at age 98, having outlived most of the intelligence officers he had betrayed and the Soviet system he had served. The Berlin Tunnel's legacy remained complicated and contested within intelligence communities on both sides of the Cold War. Some American analysts argued that despite Blake's betrayal, the tunnel had still produced valuable intelligence because the Soviets couldn't control every communication without making the deception obvious, so genuine information inevitably leaked through. Others maintained that the entire operation should be considered a loss. Its intelligence product too contaminated to trust, and its cost measured not just in wasted resources, but in false confidence that misled American policy. The debate reflected broader questions about how to evaluate intelligence in an environment where deception is always possible, where every source might be controlled, and where certainty is a dangerous illusion. For the KGB, the operation represented tradecraft at its highest level, demonstrating that the most effective deception isn't blocking enemy intelligence collection, but controlling what the enemy collects. By allowing the tunnel to operate while managing the information it intercepted, they turned an American success into a Soviet advantage without the Americans realizing they were being played. The operation became a case study in Russian intelligence training, taught to new officers as an example of how protecting a valuable source can require patience, accepting short-term intelligence losses to preserve long-term capabilities, and understanding that the enemy's confidence in their own success can be weaponized against them. The tunnel itself remained physically intact for years after its exposure, the underground chamber eventually becoming a Cold War museum after German reunification. Visitors could walk through the space where CIA technicians had worked around the clock, processing Soviet communications. Seeing the equipment that had seemed so sophisticated, and the tap points on cables that had carried Moscow's carefully prepared deceptions. Tour guides would explain the operation's technical achievements while noting almost as an afterthought that the Soviets had known about it all along. The physical space became a monument to both American ingenuity and Soviet cunning, a reminder that in espionage, the most elaborate operations can be rendered meaningless by a single well-placed source. The counterintelligence reviews, triggered by Blake's confession, extended far beyond the tunnel, forcing Western intelligence services to question every operation, every source, and every assessment from the period when Blake had access. MI6 conducted a comprehensive damage assessment, identifying operations he had known about and evaluating which ones might have been compromised. The list was extensive and devastating, including agent networks across Eastern Europe, technical operations in multiple Soviet bloc countries, and joint Anglo-American operations that Blake had accessed through his liaison assignments. The review concluded that Blake had been the most damaging penetration in British intelligence history, his betrayals costing dozens of lives and compromising operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The psychological impact on intelligence officers who had worked with Blake was profound and lasting. They had trusted him as a colleague, valued his insights, and included him in their most sensitive planning. Learning that he had been reporting everything to Moscow forced them to question their judgment about people, their ability to recognize deception, and the fundamental assumptions that made intelligence work possible. Some left the service entirely, unable to continue in a profession where such complete betrayal was possible. Others became hardened and suspicious, treating every colleague as a potential threat and every success as a possible deception. The damage to institutional trust took years to repair and arguably never fully healed. For Blake himself, living in Moscow provided material comfort but also isolation. He was celebrated by Soviet intelligence, but remained fundamentally an outsider, a British traitor living in a society he had served but never fully belonged to. His Russian improved, but never became native. His understanding of Soviet culture remained incomplete, and his ideological commitment to communism was tested by the reality of living in the Soviet system, rather than imagining it from afar. He maintained in interviews that he had no regrets, that history would vindicate his choice, but colleagues who knew him in Moscow detected loneliness beneath the ideological certainty. The isolation of a man who had betrayed everything and everyone he had known. The historical reassessment of Cold War intelligence in the decades after the Soviet Union's collapse revealed additional details about the tunnel operation and Blake's role. Declassified KGB documents confirmed that Moscow had indeed controlled the operation from the beginning, that Department D had produced most of the intercepted communications, and that the deception had successfully influenced American intelligence assessments about Soviet military capabilities. The documents also revealed internal KGB debates about whether protecting Blake was worth allowing the tunnel to continue, with some officers arguing that the intelligence value didn't justify the operational security risks. The decision to proceed had come from the highest levels of Soviet leadership, reflecting a strategic judgment that having a source inside British intelligence was more valuable than preventing American access to Soviet communications. The tunnel's story became emblematic of Cold War espionage's fundamental paradox. Both sides achieved their objectives. The CIA demonstrated technical capability and collected enormous volumes of intelligence, while the KGB protected their source and controlled what the Americans learned. Both could claim success, and both were simultaneously correct and deceived. The operation illustrated that in intelligence work, success and failure often coexist, that the most impressive achievements can conceal complete compromise, and that the side that learns the truth first wins even if they never reveal that knowledge. Modern intelligence services study the Berlin Tunnel operation as a cautionary tale about the limits of technical collection and the enduring importance of human intelligence and counterintelligence. No matter how sophisticated the technology, how clever the engineering, or how carefully the operation is planned, a single well-placed human source can render it all meaningless. The tunnel's equipment worked perfectly. Its technical execution was flawless, and its security protocols were sophisticated. Yet none of that mattered, because George Blake had access to the plans and chose to betray them. The lesson, learned painfully and at enormous cost, is that people remain the most critical vulnerability in any intelligence operation. The tunnel also demonstrated that deception operations can succeed even when logic suggests they should fail. How could the Soviets possibly control hundreds of thousands of communications without making mistakes that would reveal the deception? The answer was that they did make mistakes, small inconsistencies and improbabilities that troubled analysts like William Harvey. But those warnings were dismissed because the scale of the deception seemed impossible. Intelligence analysts wanted to believe the tunnel was genuine because it confirmed their existing assumptions and provided the kind of detailed insights they craved. That desire for confirmation created cognitive biases that made the deception more effective than it otherwise would have been. The human cost of Blake's betrayal extended far beyond the intelligence officers whose operations he compromised. The agents they had recruited, ordinary people in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union who provided information at enormous personal risk, paid with their lives when Blake identified them to the KGB. Many were arrested quietly, interrogated to determine what they had revealed, and then executed or sent to labor camps where they disappeared without trace. Their families often never learned what had happened, living for years with uncertainty about loved ones who simply vanished. Blake's ideological certainty about serving a just cause couldn't change the fact that real people, with families and hopes and fears, died because of his choices. The question of why Blake did it, what motivated a British intelligence officer to betray his country so completely, has been analyzed by psychologists, historians, and intelligence professionals for decades. Blake's own explanations emphasized ideology, his conversion to communism in that North Korean prison camp, and his genuine belief that the Soviet system represented humanity's future. But others have questioned whether ideology alone explains such comprehensive betrayal, suggesting that ego, resentment, or psychological needs for significance might have played roles he never acknowledged. The truth likely involves some combination of factors: conscious ideological commitment reinforced by unconscious psychological needs, making Blake's motivations complex and perhaps not fully understood even by himself. The Berlin Tunnel operations exposure in 1956 and Blake's confession in 1961 occurred during a period when both sides in the Cold War were experiencing serious penetrations of their intelligence services. The CIA was dealing with suspicions about Soviet penetration that would eventually lead to the destructive mole hunts of the 1960s and 1970s. The KGB was managing its own internal security concerns after several defections provided the West with detailed information about Soviet operations. Both sides were becoming increasingly paranoid, increasingly sophisticated in their counterintelligence, and increasingly aware that the espionage war was being fought as much within their own organizations as against external enemies. The technological optimism that had driven the tunnel's conception, the belief that sophisticated equipment and clever engineering could overcome human limitations, was revealed as dangerously naive. Technology could amplify human capabilities, but it couldn't eliminate human vulnerability to recruitment, ideology, or betrayal. The most secure encryption, the most sophisticated sensors, and the most carefully engineered operations all depended ultimately on people, and people could be turned. That recognition forced intelligence services to invest more heavily in counterintelligence, vetting, and security procedures, designed to detect potential traitors before they could cause catastrophic damage. The story of the Berlin Tunnel and George Blake contains layers of deception that extended even beyond the operation itself. When Blake escaped from prison in 1966, British authorities initially claimed it was entirely his own initiative, but evidence suggested KGB assistance. When the Soviet Union collapsed and archives became partially accessible, some researchers found suggestions that certain details of the tunnel operation remained classified even in Russian files, hinting at aspects of the story still unknown. The possibility exists that there were additional layers of deception or compromise that neither side has fully revealed, that the full truth remains hidden in files that have never been opened, or were destroyed to protect sources and methods. For the CIA officers who worked on the tunnel, learning about Blake's betrayal decades after the operation ended required them to reevaluate careers and achievements they had been proud of. Men who had spent years analyzing tunnel intercepts, who had written assessments and briefed policymakers based on that intelligence, had to confront the possibility that much of their work had been based on Soviet deception. Some handled that revelation with professional detachment, understanding that intelligence work always involves incomplete information and calculated risks. Others struggled with feelings of having been used, their professional expertise and dedication turned against them by a betrayal they never suspected. The tunnel itself, as a physical installation, represented one of the Cold War's most impressive engineering achievements, regardless of Blake's betrayal. The men who designed and built it solved extraordinary technical problems, excavating through unstable soil, managing groundwater, installing sophisticated electronics in an underground space with no permanent power or ventilation, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. That engineering triumph remained real even if the intelligence it produced was compromised. The technical skills, the innovation, and the operational daring deserved recognition even as the strategic outcome had to be counted as a failure. The relationship between the CIA and MI6 suffered lasting damage from Blake's betrayal, with American officers questioning whether British security was adequate to protect joint operations. That suspicion was reinforced by subsequent cases, including Kim Philby's exposure as a Soviet agent and other penetrations that suggested MI6 had serious counterintelligence problems. The special relationship between American and British intelligence services survived, but it became more guarded, with the Americans limiting what they shared and implementing additional security measures for joint operations. Trust, once broken by betrayal, required years to rebuild even between allied services with common interests. Years after Blake's confession, some intelligence analysts have argued that focusing on him as an individual traitor misses larger systemic failures that made the betrayal possible. Why was a single officer given access to so many sensitive operations? Why weren't there better compartmentalization and need-to-know restrictions that would have limited the damage any single source could cause? Why did counterintelligence fail to detect warning signs that in retrospect seemed obvious? These questions pointed to organizational and cultural issues within intelligence services, including overconfidence, inadequate vetting, and assumptions that officers from the right backgrounds and schools could be trusted automatically. The Soviet decision to let the tunnel continue rather than simply blocking it or rerouting the cables demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking that Western intelligence was slow to recognize. Moscow understood that controlling what the enemy learns can be more valuable than preventing them from learning anything. An enemy who believes they have penetrated your communications will be confident in their intelligence, will relax their search for other sources, and will be vulnerable to deception because they trust the compromised channel. The KGB's patience in running this deception for over a year, accepting the operational security risks and the complexity of managing false traffic, reflected a long-term strategic perspective that outmaneuvered American tactical cleverness. The legacy of the Berlin Tunnel operation lives on in modern intelligence tradecraft through the enduring principle that technical collection can never replace human intelligence and counterintelligence. Satellites can photograph military installations, computers can break encryption, and sensors can detect communications, but understanding what the enemy actually intends, distinguishing truth from deception, and protecting operations from compromise, all require understanding human psychology and motivation. The tunnel's lesson, learned at a cost of millions of dollars and significant intelligence damage, was that ignoring the human dimension of intelligence work invites catastrophic failure. Blake's story also illustrated the challenge of ideological motivation in espionage cases. Officers who spy for money can be detected through lifestyle analysis and financial monitoring, but officers who spy for ideological reasons are much harder to identify. Blake lived modestly, showed no signs of unexpected wealth, and maintained the lifestyle appropriate to his position. His motivation was internal and ideological, making it invisible to the security procedures designed to catch mercenary spies. That distinction forced intelligence services to develop more sophisticated psychological vetting and to pay attention to ideological indicators that might predict potential disloyalty. The tunnel operation's failure had implications beyond intelligence collection, affecting diplomatic and military strategy based on assessments that incorporated compromised tunnel intelligence. American estimates of Soviet military capabilities in Europe, deployment patterns, and readiness levels were all influenced by intercepts that the KGB had partially controlled. Those estimates in turn influenced NATO planning, defense budgets, and diplomatic negotiations during a critical period of the Cold War. The full extent of strategic misperceptions caused by Blake's betrayal may never be completely understood, but the potential for intelligence deception to influence major policy decisions was clearly demonstrated. For historians studying the Cold War, the Berlin Tunnel case provides insight into how both sides operated, the sophistication of their intelligence services, and the human drama that unfolded behind classified walls. The story contains elements of thriller fiction, the dramatic tunnel construction, the high-stakes deception, the eventual exposure and escape. Yet it was entirely real. The people involved were actual intelligence officers, making decisions with genuine consequences, not fictional characters. Their successes and failures, their brilliance and blind spots, their courage and betrayals, all shaped history in ways that remained hidden for decades, but were no less important for being secret. The technical capabilities demonstrated by the tunnel operation foreshadowed the increasing role of signals intelligence in modern espionage. The ability to intercept communications, break codes, and monitor electronic signals has become increasingly important as technology has evolved. But the tunnel's story also demonstrated that sophisticated technical collection creates opportunities for deception, that the enemy can use knowledge of your technical capabilities to feed you false information. That dynamic continues today in the digital age, where cyber operations can both collect intelligence and deliver deception, where the line between successful penetration and controlled exposure is often deliberately blurred. Blake's remarkably long life, surviving to age 98 and dying peacefully in Moscow, provided an uncomfortable contrast to the agents he betrayed, many of whom died violently or disappeared into Soviet prisons. That disparity raised questions about justice and accountability in espionage. Blake escaped legal punishment through his prison break, lived comfortably in Moscow on a KGB pension, and never faced consequences proportionate to the damage he caused. The agents he identified had no such luck. Their sacrifices unmemorialized, because acknowledging them would compromise sources and methods. The asymmetry of outcome. Traitor living to old age while victims died young, reflects the often unjust nature of intelligence work, where the guilty sometimes escape, and the innocent pay the price. The passage of time and the opening of archives has allowed for more complete assessment of the tunnel operation, though significant gaps remain. Some CIA files remain classified. Some KGB files were destroyed or have never been released, and some participants took their secrets to the grave. The historical record is therefore incomplete, pieced together from declassified documents, memoirs that may be self-serving, and analysis that must acknowledge uncertainty. Future revelations remain possible as additional archives open, or as researchers discover documents in unexpected places, meaning the tunnel's story may not yet be fully told. In the end, the Berlin Tunnel operation represented both the best and worst of Cold War espionage. The technical achievement was remarkable, demonstrating American ingenuity, daring, and capability. The intelligence failure was equally remarkable, showing how completely a single well-placed source could compromise even the most sophisticated operation. The Soviet deception was masterful, turning an enemy success into an opportunity for strategic manipulation. And George Blake's betrayal was comprehensive, causing damage that extended far beyond a single operation to affect intelligence gathering, policy decisions, and lives across Europe and beyond. The tunnel's story contains all the elements of Cold War espionage: brilliance and blindness, courage and treachery, technical sophistication, and human failure, making it a case study that continues to resonate in intelligence training and historical analysis decades after its exposure.